All right, thanks for the perfect fade as always, our DJ Katya. So excited to see everyone here tonight. Thank you so much for joining. I'm really excited to chat with Natalie. Before we, introduce properly our guest, I would like to just say a few words about what Latitude is, and why we're doing these. So you can think of Latitude as a platform that supports early stage founders in Latin America. And we do it one of the three ways. Community of founders, we now have more than 1,000 people in the community where folks find co-founders, advice, connect, and just make the journey feel less lonely. We have products that remove friction with things like corporate structures or offshore bank accounts. And if you have more, if you're curious to hear more about this, feel free to reach out, and I'm always happy to chat. And the third is capital. So we started early stage investing with our pre-seed fund, about 2 years ago, almost a year and a half. And that's been going super well. We're expanding more on that. So you'll hear more about this shortly, more exciting announcements. I think, let's kick off to the next one. And so, why are we doing these tech talks? So we've talked to hundreds and hundreds of founders. And we've seen that in Latin America, they really struggle with building solid technical teams. And even interviewing engineers myself, I realized that there's just a lack of people that are kind of prepared for this early stage journey. But also, a lot of engineers just have not heard of what is an early stage startup, what kind of challenges you may face there, and what's equity, and why it's important for your kind of like long-term upside. So we just decided to kick these off to excite people about this journey and to kind of help form more talent in the region. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our amazing guest tonight, Natalie Glance. She is a chief engineering officer at Duolingo, where my co-founder Gina worked for quite some time, and she made the intro. So thanks so much for that, Gina. Natalie worked at Duolingo since March 2015. Before that, she served as an engineering manager at Google. Natalie holds a bachelor's degree in physics from Princeton University, also a PhD in physics from Stanford, some of the schools we all might have heard of. And she started her professional journey at Xerox PARC, which pioneered like many of the technologies that we know today, from Ethernet to laser printer, to graphical interfaces to ubiquitous computing. So it's a very iconic organization, and we'll chat more about this later. And also Natalie is just an awesome person, because when we asked her to help us with our OKRs at Latitude, she jumped in and gave us a hand. So thank you so much for that. Our format will be, we'll kick off with some questions from myself, and then we'll switch to the questions from the audience, which I find always more interesting to hear from the audience than from myself. And I want to emphasize, please don't be shy and add your name to a question so we can make this more interactive. So we're not like answering anonymous. So don't be shy and make your name known. So welcome, Natalie.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Thanks for having me here. It's exciting to get a chance to talk to all of you.
Awesome. Well, we'll kick it off with a question I'm curious about, which is, if you could tell us, about your journey from like a physics researcher to software engineer practitioner, which is very unusual and interesting.
There's actually a lot of software engineers who do start in physics. It's not that uncommon. I can talk a little bit about that journey. I actually started doing physics in university because I thought of it as applied math, and I loved math ever since I was a child. And then for my PhD, I was working in an area that we called computational sociology. I wasn't actually doing straight physics. Computational sociology borrows techniques from statistical physics to model how large groups of people or computational agents behave. The idea is to understand global behavior from the sum of local interactions. And then as part of that, it involved a lot of coding. So coding was a tool that I used. I started coding actually when I was, 10 or 11. My dad brought home, my dad was at Bell Labs. He brought home a computer for me to play with at home. But then in high school, my first internship was also at Bell Labs. which, you brought up, you mentioned Xerox PARC, I think, but Bell Labs was the premier industrial science lab for many decades in the US. And there I started coding in BASIC, if anybody remembers BASIC or has even heard of it at this point. And at that time, none of the fancy scientists at Bell Labs knew how to code. This was in the 1980s. So they ended up using the software that I built over the summer as a high school student for many years. And then in university, I ended up learning first Fortran and then C as a grad student, all for the purpose of implementing models for my research work. So that's how I got started, going from physics to coding, and then eventually ended up in software engineering. Later on, I did many years as a research scientist, but then ended up at Google. So it was a transition from doing a lot of research work, writing papers, to gradually over time doing more and more software engineering and ending up managing software engineers.
Exciting. And I think I watched a talk from you where you even mentioned that early on you didn't even like programming, and then kind of felt like it was not a path for you, and then you ended up doing it anyway.
You saw that. Yeah, it's true. Like I mentioned, I started coding in middle school, 11, 12, 13 years old. And I honestly thought it was kind of boring at the time. I thought it was too much like following a recipe. That was a long time ago. Things have changed a lot. And yeah, I changed my mind about coding.
That's cool. And you have this very strong scientific foundation. How has your experience with the scientific research impacted your work at startups?
It's a very interesting question. I think scientific research is actually very different from working at a startup. They're both great experiences. Scientific research really is all about understanding what's come before you and then figuring out what the novel contribution is. It's often mostly very incremental, and really only a tiny percentage of scientists end up having a ton of impact and contributing original ideas. While at startups, we really focus on return on investment, ROI. So often it's really the obvious idea that can be the most impactful, while scientists might want to pick the most interesting, sexiest idea. So sometimes it happens that people who come from an academic background can be at a disadvantage at startups because they tend to either overcomplicate things or because they're too perfectionist. So what I found actually is when you have academics who transition to tech companies and startups, they really need to have a very strong pragmatic streak. What does translate well from academics, I think, is that sense of ownership and that ability to really work autonomously. Somebody who's capable of doing good research also has those skills to identify what the interesting problems are, to research solutions and see the work through.
That makes sense. And you mentioned Bell Labs as well, and Xerox PARC is also both are iconic research institutions. I'm just curious, how was it working there? What was the day-to-day, and how do you see the environment?
When I was at Xerox PARC, and then I was also at Xerox Research Center Europe in Grenoble, France, that was my first real job. And as a researcher, I really cared, like many researchers, I really cared deeply how I identified success. What my metric for success was writing research papers, getting them published, presenting them at conferences, getting known for the work I was doing, getting cited. While at Google, and especially at Duolingo, what I care deeply about is building products that users love and that make a big difference in their lives. So there are some people who love software engineering for its own sake, and that's great. And there are some people who love it for what they can build with it, and I'm in that latter camp. I've found that it's really important for me to work on a product that I care deeply about.
Yeah, it's we have one person on the team that says that you kind of ruin it for yourself once you try working on something that has a big impact, because you can never go back. It's just, you can convince yourself. So
for me, it's the opposite. I almost wish I had realized that about myself earlier in life, that's so important to me.
Yeah, it's amazing. And yeah, so I guess switching gears a little bit, I wanted to talk about kind of your role at Duolingo. And at least in Latin America, the title Chief Engineering Officer is not very common still. And so I was curious kind of what the key responsibilities there are, and maybe folks in the audience would be also curious to hear what is the difference between the CTO and this chief engineering officer kind of responsibilities.
It's not just in LATAM that it's uncommon everywhere. If you search LinkedIn, you will not find too many chief engineering officers. And there's a funny story behind this. So as always, there's a story. So we already have a CTO, that's Severin Hacker. He's also the co-founder of the company with Luis Van On. So he's our CTO. Can't really have two CTOs. At one point, I was promoted to be on the executive team in the C-suite. And the title we found was senior VP, senior vice president. But that doesn't really convey C-suite. There's no C in the title. And we had trouble figuring it out. And eventually it was actually me who went out and found that chief engineering officer does exist as a title. It's uncommon. And we decided to use that. So basically, it's like CTO, but it's not.
Okay.
There's two of us. We need two different titles.
That's cool. It's good to be creative.
My son tells me that it sounds like something out of Star Trek. I've tried to unhear that because I don't want to associate with Star Trek, but that's where we're at.
That's awesome. And yeah, how hands-on do you believe the engineering leaders have to be? This is something that comes up over and over in discussions that I'm having with folks.
So I'm not sure about the phrase hands-on. I think it is very important that engineering leaders have a strong technical background, and that is what we expect at Duolingo. I think for an engineering leader to be in a position to give technical feedback and to train the next generation of leaders, they need to have that strong foundation. It gives leaders the ability to have that pattern recognition of what a good system design looks like, when an execution plan makes sense. And then after that, I'm a big fan of the phrase trust but verify. Does that answer your question more or less? Yeah,
and I'm curious, like even in your own journey, are you still doing some coding? When, if not, like maybe when did you stop, or how was your relationship with the craft itself?
I am not doing any coding anymore. When I first joined Duolingo, I still was a little bit. I was doing a little bit at Google too. I considered it honestly a bit of an indulgence because it's not the best use of an engineering leader's time. I think when it is a good use is to find out the pain points of what software engineers are going through, not getting too far away from that. So if you're not doing any coding yourself, you can tell me what you do at Latitude, but I think it's important to have good ears on the ground for people you can trust who will tell you the truth about what's not working.
Yeah, we often hear from investors that sort of like the most common problem with the CTOs and startups when they grow is that the CTOs become kind of like the highest paying engineers on the staff, and that's really not the intent, right? So you have to change and adopt. It's a challenge. And yeah, I'm curious, like what motivated you to leave tech giant like Google and to join at the time a small startup, which was Duolingo?
Well, I was very interested in the area of online education, and that was just starting to take off while I was still at Google. There was suddenly a shift from classroom teaching to be to teach thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students at the same time. And this meant that those companies and initiatives that were working on that, they could much more rapidly test different approaches to teaching using A/B testing, for example. And of course, Duolingo was quickly emerging as a leader in this space. I actually went to the head of the office, the Pittsburgh office I was working in, and saying, I'd really like to work on education. Could I do that at Google? And he basically said no. So I left. I went to Duolingo, and that's the best decision I've made in my career. And then the other thing on the flip side is that I was kind of tired working at a company like Google. Big companies end up moving very, very slowly. A lot of bureaucracy and process, and I'd gotten pretty worn down by that.
Did you see a big difference between like bureaucracy and the processes that were in these big companies like Google and the research side of things, like in Park, for example, or they're pretty much kind of like run in a similar way?
Working at Xerox, the challenges was completely different. It was a completely different place. It was a completely different time. It wasn't a software engineering environment, but the biggest challenge of working for Xerox was continually having to prove to the powers that be why it was worth continuing to fund the research. I spent, I don't know, a third of my time giving presentations or working on them.
Yeah. And going deeper into the tech side of things, like what is the Duolingo's tech stack right now, and what was the thinking behind choosing it, kind of how that evolved over time?
So our tech stack consists of various technologies depending on the platform. For mobile apps, we use Swift for iOS and Kotlin for Android. And on the web, we primarily use React, Redux, and TypeScript. Backend, we use a combination of languages, primarily Python and Java, a bit of Scala, a bit of TypeScript, and we're in the cloud. We're in AWS for the cloud. So those are a few of the core technologies. That's evolved over time. Python we've used for the backend since basically day one, because it was easy to develop in. And then Swift and Kotlin are that's the main technologies used for iOS and Android.
Interesting. Yeah, and then I guess connected to that, because usually like the stack sort of answers the main challenges. Do you remember kind of like what are the main tech challenges you were solving when you joined versus now, and just kind of how they compare? Be curious if you recall.
The main technical challenges when I joined. There were a lot. It was a very small startup still, so there were a lot of things to solve. We only had manual QA. We had not much in terms of automated testing. All the code was in a monolithic code base. So one of the first big initiatives that I remember not soon after I started was we moved to microservices. So that was a big switch for the company, moving to microservices, adding unit testing. We really had very, very little process. I remember during the interview process, I mentioned that I spent a lot of my time reviewing tech specs. And then Severin and Luis turned around even before they hired me and said to the engineering team, you have to write tech specs.
Yeah, and on that note, did you bring any practices from Google to Duolingo that you recall that are like, oh, like most of it maybe is different, but hey, these things apply?
So one of the things that was really front of my mind coming from Google to Duolingo is there's some processes that Google had, some of them that I was happy to leave behind, but always thinking about what are the right processes at the right times for a company. So I ended up wearing kind of a few hats like a lot of people do at startups. And so in addition to engineering, I was wearing some of the HR hats. So I helped develop our career ladder for engineering. I brought in performance reviews, worked on the promotion process. So some of those things, bringing them from Google, but right-sizing them so that they made sense for a startup and so that we didn't go overboard.
Nice. And you mentioned you believe in this phrase of trust but verify. So I'm curious, that's something that also comes up a lot, is sort of how to measure the performance of engineering teams. Because with Agile, it's like, let folks explore and then like small iterations. But if you have multiple engineering teams, how do you measure performance, and how do you know who's in trouble and who is like ahead of the game?
That's a really good question. So in terms of engineering teams, we have a function. We don't have an engineering team. Our software engineers typically sit on product teams, which are cross-functional, along with product managers and design and so on. And we measure the performance of those teams. We will talk about whether those teams are effective and how well they're moving their metrics. In terms of engineering as a whole, and I've talked with leaders at other companies, I've read the literature. It's really hard to find metrics to measure engineering performance. Anything measurable that you can come up with, like the number of code changes, the number of bugs fixed, tickets closed, number of A/B tests, they're either gameable or just not that relevant. So we look at these numbers, but we look at them as signals, not as things we're trying to improve in of themselves. We do care a lot about uptime, so that's one measure for all of engineering. Our goal is to get to 99.99% uptime.
Makes sense. And getting deeper into the structure, so you mentioned you have cross-functional teams, which is amazing. I'm a big fan of that. Can you talk a little bit more about the overall engineering organization, how it's structured? Like if you have, engineering managers that then in turn talk to tech leads, or how is it all organized?
So first, a word about our teams. I mentioned product teams, so teams that work on features of the product. These are cross-functional. Our teams are organized around some metric that they have the mandate to improve, whether it's daily active users or retention or number of subscribers to the app. They'll have some kind of metric that they're working on improving. Our teams typically have 2 leads, one from engineering and one from product, sometimes a third lead from another function. And then the engineering lead is usually, in addition to being a team lead, also the role manager for the engineers on the team. So the role manager, also called people manager. So the engineering lead is wearing 2 hats with their engineers. One, they're the people manager who's responsible for helping them develop and advance in their career. And the other hat is helping the team achieve its goals. So it's a little bit like being a coach of a soccer team. You want your team to win, but you also want your players to develop.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And so then also sometimes there'll be a tech lead for the team. And then the tech lead and the engineering lead will share the responsibilities on the engineering side.
Cool. And do you have other like middle managers that are kind of like outside of those product team structures?
So those are first line managers for teams. Our teams are organized into areas, and the areas will also have leads. Again, usually an engineering lead and a product lead. So that engineering lead will manage the engineering managers of each of the teams. And then most of those engineering leads at the area level report either to me or to Severin.
Okay. And moving a little bit to the product itself. So you have a strong background in AI. I'm curious, kind of like how does Duolingo apply AI to scale learning?
So in the company, we're using AI in a lot of different ways. One way is to scale learning. Another is to personalize learning. And then the third is for building entirely new features. So with respect to scaling learning, well, generative AI has been a big pivot point for us in the past 6 months. And one of those ways is for scaling learning. So as we create new ways to teach, the content that we're creating for those new features, those new learning features is being drafted generative AI first. So for example, we have this new format for teaching that we're calling internally Duo Radio. We're going to be launching this in July. It's a radio play format. It's really cool. Look out for it if you're learning Spanish or French. And all the scripts were drafted using generative AI. This has allowed us to move much, much faster than we would have before. We've created something like 70 or more episodes in 1 quarter. It would have taken us much, much longer before generative AI. And then we're also using it to create new features. So we have some new features that we've been A/B testing to a small percentage of users for subscribers. One of them is called Role Play. The other one is called Coach. And these are using OpenAI's GPT-4. We were an early partner. And then the third way we use AI, and this predates generative AI, is to personalize the user experience, the learner experience. One example of this is that we have a model, internally we call it Bird Brain, that predicts for each user the probability that they will get a given exercise correct or not. And then we use that to personalize each learning session, where we target the overall difficulty of the session to be 80% right, which is kind of the sweet spot.
Oh, exciting. And expanding that out on the AI front, what are your thoughts on just kind of like what these recent technologies like ChatGPT bring to the table, and how do you see that impacting startups in general and maybe even broader?
Yeah, so I mentioned we're using GPT-4, generative AI, ChatGPT, all kind of like synonyms for this big space. For us, we see this as a really big opportunity. I get this question a lot. Am I worried that generative AI is going to mean that Duolingo becomes obsolete in the future because anybody can create a chatbot for learning languages? So it's not yes, it's not hard to create a chatbot for learning languages, but the hard part is creating an experience that's engaging enough that people want to use it for more than 15 minutes or 30 minutes. And that's what Duolingo is really good at, is creating really great, compelling, engaging experiences. And that's why we've been investing for the past 6 months, and we'll continue to investing in leveraging this new technology to create really great experiences that people want to come back to.
Yeah, and it sounds like AI is not new for Duolingo. So you've been using this, over the years, and now incorporating new tools. Do you have any advice for folks that maybe are trying to get, AI embedded into their companies? Like, what would be the approach? Like, what works, what doesn't work? Because some people say, stop everything, do the AI week, with the CEO. I'm not sure how effective that would be.
I think there's a couple different ways to think about it. One way is to spend the time to think, if you were rebuilding what you were doing AI first, what would that look like? What would you do differently? Because you don't want some competitor coming out of right field, who's able to completely reimagine a new product, and leapfrog you. So doing that exercise and having some people thinking about that. So I think that's really important, really being able to think 0 to 1 about what you could build with these new tools. And then on the flip side, I would also recommend focusing on, don't build something with generative AI just because you have this tool, right? Figure out what you want to build, what your product market fit is, what your feature set is, and using the right tools for it. And then you'll see whether AI is the right tool or not.
Yeah, that's a good advice. Coming back to the kind of engineering team and the practices, I'm curious how that's evolved, and especially different stages. Folks we have in the audience, they have anywhere from pre-seed all the way to Series B, Series C companies. What do you think kind of like is the right measure of practices or process at each different stages, and how that's journey been for Duolingo?
I can tell you a little bit about how things have evolved at Duolingo in the time I've been here. When I started, we had 40 employees, and about 25 of them were in engineering. Almost all of them were early career. We had almost no engineering processes in place. We had code review, and that was probably about it. I mentioned that we brought in tech specs about the same time that I started at Duolingo, and that we didn't even have career letters, performance reviews. We had no people team for that matter. And again, also when I first started, I was hired to be the first manager, not just in engineering, but in the whole company. Everybody until that point was reporting directly to Luis. And so I think it's important to think very intentionally about what engineering practices to add when. We have a process, we have a meta process at Duolingo called the engineering decision framework, where anybody in the company can propose an engineering decision that creates, let's say, a new process or a new way of doing things, and then send it out to all of engineering, get some feedback on it, iterate on it, and then there's a panel that meets to vote on whether to adopt it or not. And what this means is it's not just Yuri as a CTO who's saying this is how we will do things from now on, but it's a good way to get buy-in from everybody in engineering to instantiate a new process. And we have, I don't know, we've probably had about 50 or 60 of these since we started doing this, and it's led to a lot of great new ways of doing things. Now that I'll just add that now what we actually have to do is periodically review what we have in place, to check that we're not actually adding too much bureaucracy and slowing people down. So that's something that we're doing right now, is reviewing things and making sure that our processes are still what we want to have.
Amazing. Specifically about quality assurance, I'm curious, like, how do you think about that? That's something we were also recently discussing with the team. If you have like staging environments, and then how much of that is automated, how does the quality kind of discipline embedded into the engineering practice?
We have a small team of about 6 people who do manual QA, and we've intentionally kept the size of that team fixed. And then over time, moved the engineering culture to rely more and more on automated testing. So that's a tricky culture shift to do over time. We also have a very strong dog fooding culture, and that really helps us. Most of our employees use the app pretty frequently. We just did something new, actually. We added a Slack flare so that it's the adoption is growing by seeing other people. So we all have a streak flare after our names that shows how long our streak is. This is another way we're encouraging dog fooding. And we're not forcing people to use it, but it's rolling out gradually as people see other people have it. So we have a strong dog fooding culture where everybody has on their phone a pre-release version of Duolingo, so that employees are constantly using the new version ahead of most of our users and catching the bugs for us. So the pre-release version is live for 3 or 4 days before it gets rolled out to all users. And that's where we catch a lot of our bugs, and that works very well.
Nice. Yeah, that's one of the cool things about B2C apps is that, it's much easier to get a lot of folks to use them. So it's very interesting that kind of like even folks on the team are actively using the product. And yeah, looking into the future, kind of what's the Duolingo's long-term vision, and how are you planning to achieve that with technology? Is that something you're looking at proactively and saying, hey, these are the kind of next steps in the business, and we need to, maybe adopt new technologies or come up with more creative solutions on the engineering side?
So for folks who don't know, our mission is to develop the best education in the world and make it universally available. And then let me just speak to our top 3 priorities and how engineering contributes to those. So our top 3 priorities this year are, first, adding new subjects to the Duolingo app. And the first that we're going to add are math and music. This is going to go out sometime in the fall. And then the second thing is to create a standalone English language course for advanced learners. And here we're using generative AI to do that both faster and more efficiently. And then the third top priority is using generative AI to build new monetizable features and free user features. The ones I mentioned before, role play, coach, Duo Radio, and others that are coming.
Well, I'm personally very excited about the music one. Something I've been tinkering with recently, and yeah, it'd be amazing to have Duolingo providing a solution for that.
Great. I'm curious to hear what you think about it when it comes out.
Yeah. And so now I was, Natalie, I was looking at the list of questions from the audience. We have quite a few now, so I think we can switch gears and start tackling some of those. So the first one is from Felipe, and I'll ask Katya from our team to also paste it into the chat so it's easier for folks. But the first one is, what was the big differentiator for Duolingo's growth to dominate the language apps market? Which is almost like a Gina question, but yeah, curious.
Gina answer this. Gina was the differential. In addition to having Gina, maybe you can check me, Gina, if you agree with me or not. I think one big thing is it was the right app at the right time. So this predates me. The Duolingo app launched 11 years ago. We just celebrated our 11th anniversary. And that was on the web, and then it launched on iOS a few months later. So this was at a time when there weren't as many mobile apps, and it was possible to be a standout without playing the game of performance marketing. So that was a big advantage of being at the right time. And then I think the other big differential is that we made learning fun. Learning languages, it's not, anybody who's tried it, it's not easy. And Duolingo really made that a fun and engaging experience. And I think that's a lot of the secret sauce.
Awesome. So sounds like investing in the product early on, and then like that greases the wheels for the rest of the growth folks.
Yeah. And we've always been very, very product focused. Other companies that worked on language learning products tend to have a much smaller product team and much more marketing heavy. Well, we intentionally did not do any paid marketing for many, many years and grew the user base by making a great product.
Yeah, just as an addition to that, I think a lot of founders and teams just underestimate how much effort it takes to build an amazing product of any kind. And so it's always this impatience, comes from investors sometimes, like, oh, we built a thing. It's, been 6 months, 1 year. Now we need to grow it. So then like everybody starts throwing gasoline on it. It's like, it's very difficult to find patient founders that will kind of like bake the product the right way. It takes time. And so, yeah, amazing to hear that Duolingo had that journey. The next question is from Dogos. Hello, Natalie, could you describe what your day at Duolingo is like and what your main activities are?
What my day is like, let's see. If you see my calendar, you would see that I'm in a lot of meetings, but that's not a very interesting answer. So let's see. I'd say I have 3 main activities. One is, I mentioned that our product teams are organized into product areas. And we have regular weekly, bi-weekly meetings with the area leads. So several of us from the senior leadership team, Luis is the CEO and co-founder, and then myself and some other folks from the executive team will meet regularly with the area leads to get updates on their strategy and their plans and what's going well, give some feedback as needed. So those kind of more strategic level meetings is a good fraction of my time. And then lots of one-on-ones with people who report to me, skip levels, basically with the goal of scaling engineering leadership, engineering excellence. And then the third part is around recruiting and hiring and also developing people.
That's actually a follow-up question from me too. I just noticed like Duolingo has phenomenal talent. And of course, in part, it comes from the initial team, right? Like the founders and then the early employees. But just curious if what your strategies are like for recruiting. What do you do for that? It's always a big challenge for startups to attract amazing talent.
We have a great recruiting hiring machine around university. So we hire a good fraction of engineering talent straight out of university. And that's worked really, really well for us. It's a really great machine. We get great people. And the reason it also works is because we're lucky to have very strong employee retention. I've been here for 8 years. We have some new grads, some university hires who've been here 6, 7 years and who are now engineering directors. So we've grown a lot of our talent in-house. We do also hire from industry, and that's super important because we get new perspectives by hiring from industry and we get strong technical talent. And that is complementary to our university strategy, but our university strategy is really core to the success of our engineering team.
It's amazing to hear that you develop all that talent. As another follow-up to that, do you have any kind of practices in place to make it sane in the sense of like how many junior folks are joining the team? I've heard about like proportions, like maybe, cannot have more than 2 junior folks for every senior engineer. Do you have any kind of like heuristics like that?
Every year as part of headcount planning, we'll do a span of control exercise where we look at how many reports each manager has, how many people we're planning to hire, how many more managers we'll need. Some of them will convert internally, some of them will hire from the outside. And we look at ratios like number of engineers to product managers to designers. We'll look at those ratios. We'll look at ratios of engineers on product teams versus on platform teams. So there's a lot of numbers we're trying to juggle. It's not as scientific as it sounds because there's just always some parts that are unpredictable, like who leaves during, even though we have high retention, there are some people every year who leave, and that drives some of the recruiting that we need to do.
Awesome. The next question is from Felipe. I don't know if I understood the question 100%, so I'll try my best at like rephrasing it. But it sounds like he's asking, what's your take on where Duolingo fails in teaching languages as opposed to succeeding? So like, are there any shortcomings that you see within the app?
I think we're much stronger at teaching what I would call receptive language skills versus productive language skills. So being able to read and understand what somebody is saying versus being able to write and speak. And so we're pretty intentional about this. We understand what our learning gaps are, and we do planning around new features to fill those learning gaps. That's why we're working, for example, on role play. So role play is a little bit like, I mentioned it a couple of times. It's like a chatbot, but it's a task-oriented chatbot. So I don't know if anybody's got a chance to try it. So a role play scenario might be, you're planning a trip to Brazil, and what are the sites you're going to see? And then you have a conversation back and forth with GPT-4 around this scenario. So that's something that will help people improve their productive skills.
Perfect. Makes sense. And the next one is from Douglas. What advice would you give someone who just got promoted to a CTO startup? Well, congrats on the promotion, I guess. What are your thoughts, Natalie?
That's a pretty interesting question. I don't think I've gotten that one before. I think I would need a little bit more information on the startup and what the person's previous experience was.
Yeah, cool. All right, we'll just go to the next one. How do you profitably bring science to startups? Seems like there's a big trap to fall into with academics or spend a lot without a return. And that's a very interesting question in context of OpenAI, right? Because I remember people laughing when Sam Altman would say things like, hey, like, we just don't know where it's going. We're gonna like work for some years and see what happens. There was no business model kind of attached to it. So yeah, what's your take on that?
I think the way I'm interpreting this question is, you've hired some scientists, and how do you help those scientists be successful and effective in the company? Is that a fair interpretation?
Yeah, it seems like it's how to bring science into your startup to be at the forefront, which we know is important, but still do it in a profitable way. I confess that I've also hired like, PhDs and to do data science work, and it's always been a challenge to connect that kind of brain and that mentality with the rest of the startup.
Yeah, I think it's a challenge. I can't pretend to have all the answers there. I think it's important to have an onboarding process for scientists so that they understand how your company operates. And so, for example, have them shadow some engineering meetings, have them shadow various meetings where they can see how decisions get made, how prioritizations get done, how choices get made on what to work on. So that helps with the pragmatism there. And then also just having frank, open conversations about how they can be most effective. That's what everybody wants at the end of the day, is to join a company and be effective. And so talking very openly about what the difference is between academics and an industry environment, and how they can most have impact.
And I guess as a follow-up to that, at Duolingo specifically, do you have some sort of division internally where there's like a lab and folks kind of researching the future versus what's going on day to day, or is it more kind of embedded?
It's embedded. It's fairly embedded. So we have a number of different kinds of scientists. We really do have a number of different kinds of scientists. We have folks with AI backgrounds, folks with learning assessment, data science, and also learning scientists. There is occasionally we've played with the lab model. So we have a learning science lab right now where they act as consultants in different projects. So consultancy, the lab model works well when you don't actually need a full-time person embedded in a project, and that's when we use it. And otherwise, we tend to have scientists embedded into teams.
Yeah. Makes sense. The next question is from Anonymous, which is, did Duolingo try to enter a one-on-one English conversation market? Why not? The way I'm interpreting it is those platforms where you basically connect with other folks that you can learn from.
We've talked about this a lot over the years. And there are a couple of reasons why we decided not to go in this direction. One is there's no proof case of any company really being successful in this space. I mean, truly successful at a scale that would be interesting to us. And part of the hypothesis that we have here is that for most people, when they have one-on-one conversations with somebody else, it's kind of like with a chat bot. After 10, 15 minutes, they kind of run out of things to talk about. First you say, hi, I'm from this country. This is why I'm learning Spanish. And then after a while, you're kind of done.
Yeah.
So those are the kinds of conversations that we've had internally.
Cool. Yeah. And then I guess it was very intentional, right? And related to scale, it sounds like. So just like to massively scale education, you felt like you had to do it through the difficult path of software.
Or the easier path, depending on how you think about it.
Depending on how you look at it.
Humans are hard.
That's right. That's right. That's correct. And the next question is from Augusto. So what are the main qualities and characteristics you look for when you're hiring a technical person?
So we obviously look for technical excellence. So that's one thing. We have typical sorts of interview questions that to probe into technical skills. We also really care about what kind of people we're hiring. So we want to hire somebody that we will find collegial, that we will want to work with. So we don't hire people that are hard to work with, no matter how good they are.
Soft skills. I guess this one is also almost like a Gina question from Felipe. What gamification elements do you see, and which tests have you done that gave the most results? Which ones didn't work? And it would be almost, I've heard some of this from Gina, but be interesting to hear from a technical perspective also, like what goes goes on behind the scenes.
So here's a fun technical story. Everybody knows about Duolingo's notifications, right? On your phone, you'll get a notification to practice. And if you haven't practiced yet today, we've done hundreds of A/B tests on notifications. I mean, Gina's done many of these herself, but we've done hundreds since Gina as well. On Android, we were doing these experiments in the back end. So this will get to be important. You'll understand why in a minute. So each notification experiment was driven from the back end, which means we could iterate on these pretty quickly. On iOS, they were client side, which means they needed to be packaged into the app one at a time. And then at some point a few years ago, we switched the iOS ones to be back end. And because we switched the back end, we had years of advances from Android that we got on one fell swoop on iOS, and it immediately improved retention by some incredible, huge amount. So we saw the benefit of doing that all in one fell swoop.
Very cool. Very cool. Reusing the data there. The next question is from Anonymous. This comes up a lot in my office hours with founders as well. Is kind of like your thoughts on outsourcing engineering work versus hiring internally. At any point, I feel like the CTO or engineering leader is kind of faced with that dilemma, and somebody's pressuring you like, hey, why don't we just hire XYZ company to speed up things?
Yeah. I think I have a couple different answers to that. One is, we've tried a little bit. We have about 10 contractors and 10 dev contractors. We started doing this 3 years ago or so. We've kept that number at 10. It's a lot of overhead in the end to have a contractor. You need somebody to manage them. You need somebody to review their code. You need somebody to QA their work, because they're just coding. That's basically all they're doing. So we've been using contractors to port from one platform to another, and that works pretty well with this overhead. So there's that. And then the other thing is, we have a very strong in-office culture. We really believe in having product teams co-located and working together. And we think that this really helps in terms of innovation and creativity. And so, even with employees, we're in office. So you can imagine that would not be a fan of having outsourcing for folks that are on product teams.
Yeah, my challenge with that is always just sort of mercenary versus missionary mentality, and folks, just not have enough context, is what you mentioned. Just like they don't have enough context to question things, to be kind of like the product thinkers, because a lot of amazing product ideas come from engineers, and if you don't really understand the user, then sort of like you lose a big portion of that.
Absolutely.
I want to ask another question from my side, which I would hate to end the chat without asking this one. It's kind of like, what are your thoughts on diversity in technical disciplines, such as software engineering, and how can we help to tip the scales?
I care enormously about diversity. One thing I really love about Duolingo is it's actually the most diverse place I've worked at in my career. One thing that we've certainly made a lot of improvements on since that doesn't mean that we're great, right? We still have a long way to go. It just happens to be more diverse in other places. We've certainly come a long ways in terms of gender diversity. We're typically at or close to 50% of our engineering new grads who are women and applying. And then well over 50% who are people of color. We also have goals around international hires. For engineering new grads, this was also 50% this year. But all that said, we still have a long way to go to improve representation of Black, Latinx, and Middle Eastern employees. So we have a lot of work to do there. Our most successful strategy so far has been this internship program that we call Thrive. It's a program where we recruit very strong undergraduates who are primarily among these underrepresented minority groups. And then it works because they come back for a second internship and then they come back as full-time employees. So that's what's been most successful so far, but we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, those are some very impressive numbers. So yeah, I'm glad that you're giving that attention, and hopefully by example, other organizations, will follow. We see that as a huge challenge in early stage as well, where just like the numbers that are against you, if you have 3 engineers on your team, 5 engineers, 10 engineers, it's very difficult to.
So important to start early though, because if you wait till the company is larger, then it's really hard to move percentages.
Absolutely.
But if you have good representation early, then that continues to attract.
Great point. One last one from my side. I hear a lot of sort of challenges that CTOs have working with non-technical co-founders. And I guess in your case, it's almost like the opposite. You work with folks that are extremely technically capable. I'm curious what that's like, and if you have any unique challenges that you've kind of faced with that.
Let's see. It really is a big advantage from my perspective to work with technical co-founders because they understand. Maybe the disadvantage is, Luis will come and say, "You guys can do that twice as fast." I'm sure you can.
So in your experience has been super positive.
It has been, yes.
Cool.
It's nice, there's advantages of having working at a company where that mindset is very much engineering, product focused, problem solving focused.
Do you feel like in some ways that comes up? It's like, hey, like I understand this, so I want to do it a certain way, and then I guess there's probably like a lot of trust that needs to happen for folks that really know how things work on the inside to let somebody else just completely drive it.
I think there's a lot of trust that's needed for any executive in a company. Yes, so I feel very grateful to have Luis's trust.
It's amazing. Well, Natalie, I think that wraps it up. We're almost at time. Before we wrap up, I'll still want to share a few notes here on the Latitude side, but we've been really grateful to have you over. Thank you so much for all your advice and expertise, and we'll be happy to have you anytime back if you decide to come back and chat with us again. Thank you so much. But before we wrap up, I would love to give a quick heads up to everybody here that we're having a Vamos Latam Summit, which is the largest conference on startups, founders and investors in Latin America. It's going to happen in September 28 and 29 in Sao Paulo. Natalie, if you can make it, be amazing as well. You're welcome. And yeah, we did it last year and it was phenomenal. This year we're going bigger and better, and it's going to be phenomenal. So please sign up. And then on Kathy, if you can go to the next slide, if anybody's curious just to stay up to date on everything Latitude, our products, our newsletter, and many other things that we're building and working on, just go to this link tree and you'll see some stuff there. Again, thanks for everyone to join. Please fill out the CSAT or feedback link. Tell us how we did. And Natalie, thank you so much for joining. I really, really enjoyed this chat.
It was my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Thank you all. Have a good night.